Hey guys, I'm Jeremy, and today I'm going to talk about a few interesting and important things in the JonBenét Ramsey case, and I'll also add a little bit of my own research, which some of you might find interesting. I'm going to go into the events that happened on Christmas Day in 1996 and into the 26th, and I'll also go into the layout of the house and if it's possible for an intruder to actually go inside and be able to find their way around, because a lot of people assume because it's so big and the wine cellar is hard to find that you would have to be an insider, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I'll also look more closely at the garotte, the ligatures, and the knots more closely to understand more of what's going on there. John probably learned how to make knots while he was in the Navy, and Burke was in the Cub Scouts and probably learned some of this stuff. And they were also into sailing, so some people think that that's one of the reasons why they could have made the garotte. I also found some interesting things when I researched the acronym SBTC that's at the end of the ransom note. I'll also look into another random thing in this case, and the duct tape that was over JonBenét's mouth that they pulled off had a beaver hair on there. And while it might not be important, I'll kind of take a little bit of a deep dive into what that might mean. There was also a green rope that was found in John Andrews' room, which is next to JonBenét's room. And some people might not think it has any significance. The parents said that they didn't know where it came from, but we'll look into that a little bit as well. I'll also go into what's probably the most important piece of evidence in this case, and that's what happened to JonBenét late on Christmas evening, or the morning of the 26th. A lot of people, including myself, can get stuck reading the note, going down different rabbit holes and pieces of evidence, and looking at the parents or the kids' behavior in interviews. But I'm not sure how much people actually look at the autopsy and some of the pictures of what happened there. But it's quite gruesome, and she was definitely tortured before she died. I'll also go into what I think about the DNA and if this case could be solved. So I'll start this video with the events on Christmas and what the neighbors saw and what happened into the 26th, and then go into the layout of the house and then into the other things that I just mentioned. So on Christmas 1996, the Ramsey family celebrated Christmas like any other family that morning. And then later in the day, around 5 o'clock, they went to their friends, Priscilla and Fleet White, from about 5 to 9 or 10 o'clock. At this time, the neighbor across the street, Joe Barnhill, thought he saw John's older son, John Andrew, go towards the house. And so John Andrew was 21 years old at that time and was a student, but he was actually in Atlanta, so it couldn't have been him. But that's interesting that he thought he saw him, because if it wasn't him, it would have been someone that looked like him, which I would presume someone student-aged. This is a University of Colorado where you have probably 30,000 students on campus, and half of them are male that probably could look like John Andrew. So the family got home around 9 or 10 or so, and they went to bed by around 11. So that evening, the neighbor to the north, Scott Gibbons, said that he looked into the kitchen and saw that the upper lights were dimmed on low, which he said he hadn't seen in the 5 years he lived there before. This isn't verified, but I think he might have seen something in the butler pantry just below there, either like a flashlight or some other weird lights that were going on, but I'm not 100% sure. And then in the morning around 8 o'clock, he said that he saw that pantry door open. Now, people started coming over around 6 o'clock that morning, so it could have been one of the guests or like a police officer. But that is kind of weird because it is cold out, and so I don't know why someone would open the door and leave it open. But anyway, that's just what he said. On the other side, the neighbor to the south, Diane Brumfitt, said there's usually a light on the corner of the house there, and that evening it wasn't on for some reason, which was quite rare. On the west side, you have an alley, and then there's a neighbor over there, And she has some dogs, and they usually bark if someone goes down that alley. And she didn't hear the dogs bark that night. So they probably weren't in that alley on the west side of the house, which is next to the garage, basically. Across the street from the Ramseys was Melody Stanton. And her window was open a little bit. And she said between midnight and 2 a.m., she heard a horrendous scream from a child that lasted about 3 to 5 seconds and abruptly stopped. Because it was so loud, she assumed a parent would have heard that and would have come to their aid or whatever, so she didn't call the police. Later, Lou Smit did a study where they went down into the basement where there's a boiler room and there's an air duct that goes outside, and they basically screamed or made some noise to see if you can hear it across the street. And you can, because of that duct going out to the road. It kind of amplifies it a bit. But the parents are upstairs, on the 4th floor from the basement, and also 70 or 80 feet back, so they would not have heard that. Melody Stanton, who heard the scream, fell asleep about 10 minutes later or so, and around that time, her husband, Luther Stanton, heard a sound resembling metal scraping against concrete or something to this extent, which could be near the basement window. There's a big crate that can open up, or someone could have dropped a bat on the cement. Later, someone had called into a radio station in the days after this, or weeks, and said they were a neighbor close by, not one of the ones I mentioned, but someone else, and they said they saw someone running from the house that morning. So I didn't get an exact time on that, but if they left in the morning, it could have been after they called the police, which is pretty crazy, but I guess could be a possibility. So the mother, Patsy, got up that morning around 5:45 and went downstairs to make coffee, and she saw a ransom note at the bottom of the spiral staircase. She just read the part that said, "We have your daughter." She freaked out. She went upstairs to see if she was there, and she wasn't. She screamed to her husband, and he said, call the police. The police were there within a few minutes. And the first officer to go downstairs was Reichenbach. And it was just after 6 a.m. And when you go down the stairs, you could walk straight. And that's where the cellar room door is. And he went to open it. But there was a little latch at the top that kept it from opening. And so he didn't look any further. It didn't open. And so he went back upstairs. Around 6:30 a.m., John's friend, Fleet White, went downstairs and also went to the cellar door. This time he did turn the latch and open the door, and it's dark in there. And I guess there is one light switch to the left that shouldn't be that hard to find, but the other one's down to the right, I think 2 or 3 feet off the ground, and so it's a little unusual. And so he didn't find the light, and so he closed the door and turned the latch and left. Sometime around 8:15, Officer French goes downstairs. He walks up to the door. He looks. He saw the latch, and he was thinking it was a kidnapping. So if someone had escaped out of that room, there's no way you could latch it from the front. So he didn't even look inside. So after Patsy called the police that morning, she invited a bunch of friends over. And so there were a lot of people contaminating the crime scene. Maybe not in the basement, but around the kitchen and other areas in the house. And there was supposed to be a ransom call between 10 and noon, and nothing happened. And so the only detective that was left there was Linda Arndt. And I'm not sure why she wasn't searching through the house. That's her job. Maybe she was observing the family or whatever. But she eventually told John, "Why don't you go with your friend Fleet White and search the house again?" So he goes downstairs, and he does open the wine cellar and turns on the light, and he finds her. He takes off the duct tape off her face and puts it on the blanket that's on the ground, and then carries her upstairs. As he screamed. They're saying call the police and everything like that. He put her down on the ground near the front door because Linda Arndt told him to do that. And then she picked up JonBenet and put her near the Christmas tree. And then later they put a blanket on her. And then later the parents were over her and crying. So the crime scene was totally contaminated. So, of course, one of the big ideas is that one of the family members would have did it, either John, Patsy, or the son. The other idea is that an intruder came in either through the basement, through a broken window, or they might have come through that pantry door on the north side. Jon initially said that he had closed all of the doors and windows that night. I think it was just self-preservation, and you're trying to save face. I think it would be very easy for him at the end of the day to possibly forget one of these doors. Now, if these intruders came in while they were at dinner, I could see at that time when they left, they're grabbing gifts and all these things. They probably didn't make sure all the doors were closed because they're thinking, oh, we're just gone for 2 or 3 hours. We'll be back. And maybe he even did close all the doors and windows at like 10 or 11 o'clock. But the problem is that the intruders were probably in there since about 5:30 or so. And in the suburbs back in the 90s, I don't think everyone locked their doors. Like I remember always coming home and we got in pretty easily. Maybe the front door is locked, but there's like always one door open in case you need to get in. Because kids don't always remember where like keys and stuff are at. So I wouldn't be surprised if one of the doors was open. I know I've, once in a blue moon, I only have one door and I've forgotten to lock that. So I think someone with 8 doors and 100 windows might make that mistake once in a while, especially if they're tired after a long day. So this is a huge house that has 4 different floors, including the basement, and is over 7,200 square feet. It's a Tudor-style home that was built almost 100 years ago in 1927, and there was a large addition that was put on the west side, and then Jon and Patsy also added an extra floor on that side, which would be their bedroom and a couple other rooms there. So a super big place. JonBenet was below them and like in almost the other side of the house. So it's a floor down and about 70 feet away. So it would definitely not be very easy to hear what was going on down there. So it's definitely more complicated than your average home. But I don't think that you would previously need to know the layout of the house to get a good understanding, especially if you had gone there when they were gone. I think within, 20, 30 minutes, you would know the layout pretty well. So in between December 12th and December 25th, 1996, there were about 14 burglaries in Boulder in the northwest part of town and some other areas. So they were more in the south, but it's possible that it could happen there too. And that report was in January. So the burglaries ended on December 25th. Was this the same group of people? Or maybe they got spooked because of all the publicity? But let's think about burglars in general. Like, I doubt they know the layout of all these homes, right? They don't need to know every nook and cranny, but like, where are the valuable goods and where are the bedrooms where people might be and who to avoid? And I imagine these people are very bold to actually go into people's bedrooms while they're sleeping to look for jewelry, because I imagine a lot of the time it is in people's bedrooms. And people could wake up at any time to like go to the bathroom or get food or whatever. So, and they're not doing this in the daytime, obviously. I mean, it must be pitch black. And I think it's a better idea to rob a bigger house, not just because there's more money, because there's less of a chance that you'll get heard doing it. If you break into a little house or a trailer, you might find some cans of Spam and a NASCAR hat, but you might also get blasted with a shotgun from a guy in the next room like 10 feet away. So if you're in a mansion and someone comes down, for instance, and you see the light come on, I mean, you have plenty of time to either escape or hide in many of the closets or rooms. But in a small house, there's much less of an area to either hide or escape. So as I mentioned, the family's gone for 4 hours. The person was probably waiting for them to leave and tracking them when they came in and was able to get a good layout within 20 or 30 minutes. Like I said, they don't need to know every nook and cranny. They just need to know the important areas. So if they went in and let's say they started from the top, they would see that the parents' bedroom is up there. And they know that's not an area they need to go back to. Then they would go to the second floor. They would see a few bedrooms there. 2 of them would be guest bedrooms. And one of the other rooms would be Burke's, which you could tell by the boys' like toys and clothing. And then you would see JonBenét's room with all of the trophies and girls' things. They would also find that the room next to JonBenet was John Andrews' room, which also was over the garage, and you could see where the parents would come home. And then they would probably look around the house for potential weapons that they might use or weapons that could get used against them. And they would look at places to hide and the exits of the home. I'm not surprised that they didn't write the ransom note beforehand, because I don't even think they knew they could get into this home. I think they were lucky that either a door was open or that basement window was open. And they also had to make sure that an alarm didn't go off. So once they were inside and kind of felt secure, they were like, let's write a ransom note as a diversion note, basically. And so John Andrews' room and JonBenét's room and most of the exits are all pretty close to that spiral staircase. And the stairs down to the basement is just on the other side of the butler's pantry. So you would come down and you could walk through the pantry and come around the corner to go down into the basement. And the butler's pantry would be a really good way to either enter or exit because it's kind of in a hidden area. You have that neighbor to the north, but there's a fence there and some trees. And if you try to go up towards the garage, there's a fence. And so it's blocked there. And then from the other way, you're basically out onto the street again. And that neighbor had a fence, so if you duck down a little bit and it's dark, they wouldn't see what was going on there. But like if the family was going to come down, I think they'd like go to the kitchen or the living room or out other exits, but not that one. Where the broken window is on the opposite side is also a great entrance because people can't see you from the north, west, or east. The house in the south might be able to see you, but they've only got one window upstairs, and there's a couple trees there too, so I don't even know if they'd be able to see through there easily. So the basement is actually smaller than the other floors because it's part of the original home. So there's nothing below like the garage in that western area. And when you get to the bottom of the stairs and go to the right, you've got that laundry room and then a storage room behind that. In front of you is the train room. And to the right of that is another storage room, and where that broken window is, that you could get in and out. And then below the window, there's that suitcase there. Further south of that room, there's actually two large crawl spaces. And I was thinking this would be a great place to hide. But I saw in a video that that's actually a crawl space that's up like near the ceiling. So it wouldn't be easy to get up into, basically. Apparently there was a canvas bag up there that was not the family's, but I don't know if there's any significance there. And then there's a boiler room and a sink in the wine cellar room. So when you go downstairs and actually look to the right, the first door that you'd see down the hallway is actually the wine cellar door. I think most people, including myself, thought this was like a very hidden door. Like there was no knob. And maybe it was a sliding door, or there was like a little latch, but you wouldn't even see the outline of the door, like this secret thing, but it's not. I mean, there's a door handle there, and it's obviously a door. The only unusual thing about it is that it has this little latch up there. And this kind of layout, in general, isn't very unusual for a basement. Many basements have a furnished area and an unfurnished area. The house I grew up in had a nice area with a big screen TV and a bar and an area we all hung out in. And then there was like a separate room where like my dad had all of his tools and all of this other stuff in. And so people don't want their kids to go in an area with like saws and nails and tools and things. So they might have a special lock or a key for that kind of room. So the family didn't keep tools in there. They actually kept their decorations for Christmas and their gifts in there. So I imagine if these people were in there for a few hours, they probably tried most of the doors on the house, including that one. And if that was the only door in the house that was like kind of hard to get into, like they would probably be more curious and probably move the latch and see that that was there. So it's believed that JonBenet might have been killed in that boiler room. And so the wine cellar's the closest door next to you, and it's kind of hidden, so it would kind of make sense. And it was a great idea to put her in there because it did fool at least 3 people from finding her until John found her at 1 o'clock, 7 hours after they called the police. So that bought them a lot of time. So let's go into some of the evidence and things that were believed to be brought in the home, tampered with, or taken away. So as I just mentioned, there was that suitcase placed under the window, which might have been used to like come in or out. There is a scuff mark on the wall in front of it. So maybe someone was holding on to like the windowsill when they came down or going up. And so, by the way, this window was broken the summer before because John couldn't get inside. He forgot his key, so he broke that window and came down that way to get inside the house. And so I imagine they cleaned most of the glass that was on the floor in the house because there's kids there. But there probably was little pieces of glass like in the windowsill. And one of these little pieces of glass was on the suitcase, which makes me think that someone had come into the home and then they put the suitcase there for like a second person who stepped down, and on their way down, there was a little piece of glass in the windowsill that fell off on top of the suitcase. There were also some leaves and packing peanuts around the windowsill, and a little bit of those leaves look like they're around that suitcase. And John had actually asked the housekeeper's husband to fix that window, but he never did, which could be another reason why they might be suspects, because they also knew about the wine cellar room because they got the Christmas decoration out the month before during Thanksgiving. I just did a long video on the housekeeper a few weeks ago you could check out. So there's a spider web in the window and also like on the crate that you moved up. So some people said that there could have been no one that could have come down there because the spider web would have been disturbed. I don't know if that's true. I see that there's a spider web in the corner, and I think people could have gotten in without disturbing that spider web. I'm not sure about anything up on that crate. But even if they didn't come in or out that way, if they did come down into the basement, they have a problem. On the first floor, you have 8 doors to escape from. In the basement, there's no doors. So you have to find a window that you can escape from in case the father turns on the light and comes down. So I assume one of the first things they did when they got down there, they would have checked to see what windows they could get out of in case they have to flee. Obviously, near the suitcase was one I mentioned. And then there's a toilet just around the corner from where the stairs come down. You've got this small bathroom, and there was apparently a little bit of like a foot mark or something on top of that lid. And it looks like the police not only took that lid, but they like took apart that toilet, maybe to see if anything was flushed down there. And they might have gone on top of that toilet because there is a window up there that maybe they were trying to see if they could get out. And on the outside of the window, there was some disturbance. So before, when they were outside, before they got like to the pantry door, they might have been checking all the windows to see where you can get in or out. There was a flashlight that supposedly didn't belong to the Ramseys that was on the middle of the kitchen room table, which seemed really out of place. There were no fingerprints on the flashlight or on any of the batteries. Now, I think John Andrew bought one of those flashlights for his father, but I don't know why else he would have that on the middle of a kitchen table. I could imagine if it was an intruder, they might have come into that room where they dimmed the lights, and then they might have like wrote the note in that room and left the flashlight there and just forgot about it. So up in John Andrews' room above the garage, there was a green rope that was found that supposedly no one in the family knew about. And there was also a black backpack there. I didn't get to see a photo of the backpack, but it might have been like a little paratrooper backpack or something. So I'm not sure about that detail, but there was definitely this rope there that was, I think, about 12 or 13 feet. So maybe that was something that would have been used like to tie her up or something. And so now some people think that that was a rope that was used in some decoration around the house or in some of JonBenét's photos. I don't see a green rope anywhere. Although there is one black and white photo that looks like it could be a green rope, but I'm not sure if that photo was taken at a studio and that was one of their props, or if that was something that was like taken from their home. There was a bowl of pineapple on the table and a cup of tea. That has Burke and Patsy's fingerprints on it. And so there's this big story that Burke came down in the middle of the night, and then so did JonBenet. They got in a big fight, and he ended her life, basically. Well, that could be possible in some circumstances. I don't think he would know how to make this Garotte and strangle her in that way. This seems much more like a sadistic pedophile would have did something like that. So there were also cigarette butts outside the butler's pantry door. I don't know when those cigarette butts were there, like if this was from workers or friends from a week before or several months, but that might be important for something later I'll mention. And then, as I said, there's this 3-page ransom note that was on the spiral staircase, and that was written from a pad that I think was around the kitchen, and also the marker that was used to write the note was in one of the cups there too. So it definitely came from the house, which is one of the reasons why they think Patsy wrote it. And I just made a long video about the ransom note in my last video you could check out, which goes into more details about that. But I don't think that she wrote the note. A neighbor found a latex glove in their trash can in the alley. These guys definitely were wearing latex gloves because there's no fingerprints or anything in the house for the most part. One of the officers found an earring on the front curb outside of the residence. It didn't belong to anyone inside. Maybe it's no importance and could be a jogger, but maybe there was a female that was running away or something. And maybe that's who also wrote the note, because most people think there was a feminine tone to that note. So now I'll go into what was in and around the cellar door. So there were some paint brushes nearby, I think in the train room, and that was broken and used to make the Garotte, and was probably used to penetrate her private area, and was most likely taken as a trophy. There was also 1 or 2 knives nearby, one that was maybe outside the room and one that was like not far from her body. So this is also a big controversy because Linda Hoffman, who is the housekeeper and could have been involved, so she might be on the defensive here, but she had made the point of saying how the boy, Burke, would go around the house with his Swiss Army knife and keep cutting all these like pieces of wood and leaving all of these chafings all over the house. She got really annoyed, so she hid the knife up in a cupboard kind of near JonBenet's room where he wouldn't find it. So since they found a knife near JonBenet, everyone made this correlation that Burke was probably down there. But from what I understand, it was a smaller pocket knife with a purple ornament. And that ornament was broken off. And so Patsy Ramsey had actually been in Switzerland and got Burke the Swiss Army knife, which had his name on it. That was the one that was hidden upstairs. This other smaller one might have been down there, but that doesn't mean that that had any affiliation with Burke being down there. They probably could have used a knife because the ligatures that they used around her neck are not easy to like just break with your hands. You need a knife to cut those, especially if it's 550 cord. In the inventory, it basically said like something like pocket knife with broken purple ornament. But if the police were to put that in inventory and it had his name on it, I'm sure they would have written that down because that would be an important thing to label. So inside the wine cellar was JonBenet on the ground. She had the rope and Garotte around her neck, and then there was some of the ligatures around one of her hands. And I'll go into that more in a little bit. And then there was duct tape over her mouth that John had taken off. And she was laying on a blanket there, and then she had maybe her pajamas next to her as well. Those white ligatures that were used to strangle her, and the black duct tape was apparently not from the home as well. The black duct tape had some different color fibers that included red fibers that were thought to be from Patsy's clothing. But that tape was on the blanket that her mother had touched before, and a lot of this stuff's contaminated, so to me it's not like a smoking gun or anything. But the weird thing on that duct tape is that there was animal hair that was thought to be beaver hair. which is pretty random because I could see other animals that might be on the tape, like a dog, a cat, a squirrel that got into the house, or a mouse or something. But a beaver is quite unusual because beavers don't usually like get into anyone's home. So now maybe Patsy had a fur coat, or someone else did that maybe had beaver and that fell off. But there could be another reason for that I'll mention in a few minutes. So there was this high-tech boot print in there as well that could have come from any number of the police that went down there or workers in the previous months. And so I don't think there was much significance that came from that. Some people said it was Burke or John Andrew, but I don't think there's necessarily like a big significance. So the clothes that JonBenet went to bed in and what she was found in were different. She was found in these underpants, which were like much bigger than her size. I think it was something like a 13-year-old would wear. So that's a little unusual. So although a lot of people think she wet her bed, she didn't. There's no evidence support that she wet her bed, and you could even look at it in the photos and you don't see anything like that there. If you look in the bathroom, it looks like she left her pants there next to the toilet. I know she had a wiping problem too, so maybe after she went to the bathroom, she just changed all of her clothes. I'm not sure. It's no surprise that the pants she was wearing when she died was wet because, of course, she's being tortured and died, so it was not a big shocker that she went to the bathroom. So many people are wondering why someone would leave a blanket in her nightgown there. Some people think, well, it must have been the mom who did it. But I think that one of the guys accidentally ended up ending her life, and maybe he or the other person felt bad and put that there in kind of a comforting way because that wasn't part of the plan. And they also might have wanted the extra clothes because they were taking her either for a few hours or a full day or the next day, and they were thinking maybe this girl might wet her pants, so let's bring some extra clothes. So many people think that she was sexually abused. I don't think a lot of people have enough evidence to substantiate that off that one autopsy report. Her pediatrician had seen her many, many times. I think over a 2-year period, she went to the doctor like 30 times or something. And he said that there was nothing unusual about that aspect. So it could be possible still that someone did that to her, but it doesn't mean that the parents did it. So the next part, I'll go into the autopsy because I think this is super important. And I doubt most people can understand it, including myself, unless you do a little research. I'll put a link below for some of the photos. And if you're really serious about this case, you should look at them. Because if you're going to spend all of this time going down rabbit holes about the pineapple and the family did it, and you've never even seen the autopsy photos, then you're really missing a big part. Of course, it's disturbing, but I think it holds more of a clue as to the profile of someone that would have did this. And the strangulation and these marks and what happened to her definitely indicates that she was tortured, which is why it seems less likely that the family would do this, especially if she was still alive. So the pathologist, John Myers, wrote, "Clinico-pathological correlation. Cause of death of this 6-year-old female is asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma." So JonBenet was blasted in the head and had her skull completely cracked open. Now, it didn't break the skin, so there was no bleeding. But you could see in the autopsy photos that it was cracked all the way up, about 8.5 inches. And at the top, there was almost like a hole. It seems like she was hit with like a flashlight, in my opinion. Now, there was golf clubs nearby. That could have been a possibility. And of course, a baseball bat too. So the blood from this hemorrhaging was only about 1.5 tablespoons, meaning that someone strangled her soon afterwards. But you could see from these ligatures around her neck that it was super tight, but not loosely done like it was staged. All around her eyes and neck and shoulders, near where she was strangled, have what's called petechial hemorrhaging. And what this is like these red marks on her neck, and you can't see her eyes, but if she opened her eyes, you would see all these little red dots, which look like a rash, and that's this petechial hemorrhaging. And that only happens, for the most part, when you're strangled or die by asphyxia. So if she was hit in the head, she would have been still alive. So that means that her parents wouldn't have taken her to a hospital. They would be like, well, I don't know if she'll die or not. What do you want to do? Take her to the hospital or stage a kidnapping? So that seems weird to me. And as far as I know, she was also alive when she was violated. That would also seem very bizarre to have a family member do that. And then there's other marks on her. There's a couple black dots. They're 2 inches apart that are in her lower back. And Lou Smit, the homicide detective from Colorado Springs, believed that was from a stun gun, like a taser. And you can look on photos online, and it definitely looks like it's a possibility that they used this taser on her at some point. And then there's also another mark around her chin, and that also could be from part of the stun gun. And someone also mentioned it might be a cigarette, but I don't think they found a cigarette butt there or like smelled smoke, so I don't know about that. And as I mentioned, they went inside of her with this paintbrush and then apparently like cleaned her out with something. And I guess they took these away as like a trophy or something. And so there was some blood on her thigh, shirt, underwear, and a few other little things. They used these DNA tests over the years and found that it was her blood. And there was also some unknown male, but no one in the family was matched to anything they tested. So I'm not a pathologist or a homicide detective or a forensic expert. So I went to see what some of them think. And as I mentioned, this guy, Lou Smit, believed it was an intruder. He had already prosecuted like 200 homicides in Colorado Springs and like really high profile cases. And so this is a really well-respected guy in his field who knows a lot. And then you have the other people working on the case like Steve Thomas, Linda Arndt, and John Eller, who had little or no experience dealing with any homicides. And so it surprises me so much that everyone thinks this guy Lou Smit is this crazy old man, but I trust people with no experience. It's very bizarre to me. And so I also have been watching some other YouTube channels on people who are professionals in their field. This one channel called The Interview Room with Chris McDonough is really good. He's got 25 years as a police officer and 13 years where as a homicide detective. He solved tons of different cases and is an expert in his field with these, kidnappings and high-profile child homicides. And he's had a co-host for a few episodes whose name is Dr. Gary Bricado. He's a clinical psychologist, and he researches all of these kinds of crimes. And you could go through these episodes as they look through the note and analyze the profile of this suspect. And they also believe that there's no way that the family did it. And this is an intruder who's a sadistic pedophile. This is someone that gets off from erotic asphyxiation. He had probably seen JonBenet in these pageants or in the parade in town or at a talent show at the mall and became infatuated with her and wanted to carry out this insane fantasy he had of her. And that's why he didn't just strangle her. You use this garrote because you want this erotic asphyxiation. It's not just about killing, it's about torturing and using this device. And so I think very few people even know what this garrote is or this kind of erotic asphyxiation, especially a 9-year-old like Burke who's into Nintendo and trains. Like, I don't think he has this erotic asphyxiation idea with a 6-year-old sister. Because if most people are going to strangle someone, you're just going to use your hands. Or you could come up behind someone and choke them. So the fact that he would make this elaborate device seems a little bit unusual. So just to give a little background of the garrote, that word itself is actually the Spanish word for the piece of wood that is either attached to it or you use to turn like the rope or the chain or collar or a wire that would, as you turn this thing, it would get tighter and tighter around your neck and eventually suffocate you. It was originally used in Roman times for a little bit and then became really big in Spain during the Spanish Inquisition and was popular into like the 19th and 20th centuries. And so this type of method of killing people was used by assassins over the years because it's a good way to come up from behind someone and kill them without making any noise. Since World War II, the garrote has been regularly used as a weapon by soldiers as a silent means of killing sentries and other enemy personnel. Instruction in the use of purpose-built and improvised garrotes is included in the training of many elite military units and special forces. So let's go into the knots that were used in this garrote and if John or Burke would have known how to do this. So although the garrote is unusual and unique to use in many ways, the knots, from what I can see, don't really look that complicated. Maybe the one with the toggle is a little bit more complicated, but in general, they just look like granny knots to me that are very basic, or something like a slip knot, which is really basic too. Now, I'm not an expert in knots or anything, but I have worked as a commercial fisherman in Alaska for 3 summers as a salmon fisherman, basically. So we're dealing with tying knots and things with ropes and lines all day, obviously. And so I'm not a pro, but I definitely know the basics. And I was actually in the Cub Scouts way back in the day. And I was in the Army for 4 years as a paratrooper. So I've been around some of these ropes and knots over the years from time to time. So John graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1966. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering. And so there's a photo of him, and below it, it says he specialized in jury rigging and he patched together a blue gig machine. So jury rigging is learning how to take makeshift things on a boat and repair the boat if you don't actually have the proper tools. So this might have been something that he learned like in his training, like around college or in the academy, but it's not something like he's doing all the time and would remember like 30 years later. When he was in the Navy, he was in Subic Bay in the Philippines and was an aviator. So he's flying and on a base. He's not even on a ship. And if he was on a ship, he's on like a huge boat. And he's not tying knots and things. That's what enlisted guys do. Just like I was a fisherman on a boat, I'm doing all the running around with the other workers, tying and doing things. And the skipper, or like an officer, would be making the decisions of where to go and what to do. And so they do some of the work, but they're mostly planning what to do, not making knots. And so he got into sailing right before like JonBenet died. And when he was interviewed, he said that he didn't really know that many knots, besides like tying up his cleat when you go to dock in the slip and some basic things. And that probably makes sense because you're not using so many complicated knots on a boat every day. You're going to use a few basic things like a half hitch or a clove hitch. And there's a lot of hooks and carabiners that you use these days to make things easier. Because like, for instance, when you're on like a fishing boat, you're rushing to do things very quickly. You don't want to like tie up a lot of things quickly, and then if you make any mistake, if you try to untie it, it could get caught and it could take a long time. So Burke was in the Cub Scouts and was probably a Weeblos, and you do learn about 4 knots at that level, but it looks like nothing of any of the knots that are used in that garrote. There's one called the toggle or like a commando knot, but that's used to like help people up something. It's not like something that contracts. It's something that stays the same size. Now there's the Prusik knot, which is probably the closest thing, but even that looks quite a bit different. But they might have used something like that to get it together. But to be honest, you could throw all of these things together within a minute. And even a granny knot can stay tight and can move up and down, and you could strangle someone with it. So there's a couple ways you might make a garrote. You could have 2 of the handles on the end like this, and you could put that around someone and tighten that. Or what you could do is you could put this around someone, and you can have a toggle on the other side here, and then use it as like a one-handed device, or you could use 2 hands with that. And if you don't want to make 2 loops, you can also make 2 toggles on the ends. And the reason why you would either make 2 loops or 2 toggles is because if you don't have a toggle on the end and you try to pull that, you're going to pull it through if you don't have like a loop or a toggle at the end. So I was looking at this picture closely, and you could see the one that was around her neck with the wooden toggle. And then there's another one around her hand that looks very strange because it's not tight enough to go around either one of her hands. And I realized that that's probably one of the Garottes. I think they were making the first one, and for whatever reason, either the knot or something didn't work out right. So he ended up making a second one, and then he was just using that probably to try to control her hands a bit. Because if you look in the photo, you could see her trying to probably pull off where she was getting strangled because there's little marks of where her nails probably went in. Another reason why they would have used the garrote is not just the erotic asphyxia, but because if they're using their hands and really close to her, she is moving her hands and trying to scratch them, and she could get their DNA under the nails. So it's better to have some kind of thing like behind her where they can pull it and try to keep her away. So one unusual thing about one of the loops is that there's like another smaller loop attached to one of them. And I think I know what that is too. It's a quick release. So when I was fishing and putting buoys on like the side of the boat or doing different things, a lot of the time you just want to put it in a knot that you can untie immediately. And so you do like something like a half hitch or whatever. And then when you're done, you pull the one line and it comes undone. I could imagine if they were trying to choke her, there would be a certain point where they would want to release it, like not to kill her or whatever. And so I think that was one of the reasons why they had the quick release. And I think that maybe didn't work out well, which is maybe the reason why they moved on to the toggle one. But you could see in these knots that her hair is inside of them, meaning that this was not pre-planned. And so this is also something that was like in the heat of the moment. I think they tried to take her out of the house. It didn't work. And then this was like plan B, basically. So when I first looked at the ligatures around her neck, I assumed they were 550 cord, which I have here. And this is really popular in the Army. It's called 550 cord because it technically could hold up to 550 pounds. Now, they don't use it for up to 550 pounds. They'll use it for up to like 200 or 300. But these were the cords they used to attach to the parachute when people, had jumped out of planes. But it's also used for a lot of other things because it's very narrow and small and very strong. Like there's no way I could break this with my hand or anything like that. But anyway, that got me thinking, like a lot of people don't even know what 550 cord is unless they've been in the military. Now, I do know a lot of survivalists use them too, and it's pretty popular these days, but I'm not really sure in the 90s who was aware of this. And so I was thinking that there's several bases in Colorado. You've got the Air Force Academy, you've got Buckley Space Force Base, which was an Air Force base before. So a lot of Air Force bases, and then you have Fort Carson just next to Colorado Springs. And although there are a lot of honorable people in the military, like myself, of course, there's some shady characters. And I was just glancing at some things happening in the 90s. This guy in 1996 who broke into, I think, the basement of a home, and he ended up only recently getting busted for that through fingerprints. I'll mention a little bit about that later. And then I just saw another big case recently where this Army guy strangled Air Force soldier back in 1987, and they just solved it recently. So at the end of the ransom note, it says Victory SBTC. There's a few theories about this. Some people think it means saved by the cross, which I don't really think makes sense because she wasn't saved. And I don't think the person's thinking about like religion, like a cross. But that's a possibility. Some people said it stood for Subic Bay Training Center, like where John was at, but he wasn't at Subic Bay Training Center. He was at the U.S. Naval Base, Subic Bay. So the acronym's different. Others think it could be a saying from John Mark Carr, who actually confessed in the 2000s to the crime, and then he was found to be innocent, so he's just a total whack job. But he used to sign things saying, "I shall be the conqueror," which has that acronym, so that could be a possibility. But most of these things didn't really seem a match to me. And there's many other ideas, but it's still unknown. So I was kind of curious if a soldier could be involved. When I saw victory on that ransom note, it definitely reminded me of the Army. Of course, people use victory in sports games and other things, but it's definitely much more associated with the Army, in my opinion, and war. So the Army uses so many different acronyms for every little thing that we do, which also includes the units. So in the Army, there's many different levels of the units. It could start up at like the corps and then go down to the division, brigade, battalion, company, squad, etc. And each of these units has different acronyms to distinguish it from other units. And even each of those units might have a different motto. And so there's obviously tons of different Army units, not just around the United States, but all over the world. So I was figuring, even if there was one, it probably wouldn't be anywhere near. And then I found at Fort Carson, there's the 1st Stryker Brigade Combat Team, SBCT. So that's not exactly the same because the C and T is switched. Maybe they didn't want to be exact, so they changed it a little bit. Or maybe there's no correlation, but I found that was interesting. So they have the 1st and 2nd SBCT Brigade, which comprises of about 9,000 soldiers together. So there's about 27,000 soldiers on that base. That means that 1 out of 3 soldiers in Fort Carson is in the SBCT. So as much as it's fun to hang out on base or in military towns, I know when I was in the military, I would head up to like some college towns or other cities to get away from the base. If you love going to sausage parties, it could be fun, but sometimes it's nice to escape from the Army and go hang out with some civilians and meet girls and just other people in general. So maybe this guy was leaving base and going up to these different towns, but he wasn't into college girls. He was into very young girls. And if he was hanging out in like the main tourist area or hangout area, that would be Pearl Street in Boulder, which is where all the bars are located. And that's actually where John Ramsey's company, Axis Graphics, was located. He had about 300 employees, and they had made $1 billion in sales that year throughout all of the company. So there's no doubt that these guys are working in sales, making good money, getting off work, hitting the bars and these different business establishments. I'm sure some Army guys could have befriended some people in these bars who mentioned they worked for this company and mentioned how this guy was this rich dude who lived in this huge house and had this, beautiful little princess. And who knows if some of these people were disgruntled workers who had some ideas of doing something really bad. I know some people had gotten fired for unusual things, like they said that they didn't smoke, even though they did smoke, and he fired them just because they were technically not telling the truth. So who knows if, one of these guys is angry about his work and you meet a military guy who's got experience doing stuff, maybe they're going to pay him to go do some crazy things. Or the interest is not money and could obviously just be the fact that they're like a pedo. So let's look back at that rope in John Andrews' room that the family didn't recognize. Most of the ropes in those photos I mentioned were yellow or white that JonBenet used or were in the home. And this one's green. Usually in the Army, you use a green rope, just like you use green camouflage in a green uniform. There could be a possible correlation there or just a coincidence. So let's go into the beaver hair that was on the duct tape. That was really random. I happened to just befriend a guy who was in one of my international groups, and he's actually into trapping animals that like get into people's homes or into government buildings or whatever. And so that's what he does for a living. And so I asked him about like hunting or trapping beavers. I was like, is that something you shoot? And he said, no, they're always trapped because you can't shoot them in the day, but they're normally out at night. And so I asked him, do you ever use duct tape? And he said, yeah, sometimes you use duct tape on the traps or to attach different things. And so I was thinking, geez, like, what if people are using the tape on a regular basis to catch like beavers? And when they tore off a little piece of tape, you always have that lip that's up and a little piece of hair got on that. Who knows? Maybe there's something there. So beaver trapping is apparently popular around Colorado Springs. People go around Pikes Peak. And there's this other area called Beaver Creek State Wildlife Area where you could catch beavers. There's a Colorado Trappers and Predator Hunters Association that's in Cannon City, which is less than an hour from Colorado Springs. And you know where else you can trap beavers? Right there in Fort Carson. You can actually hunt there and go fishing. And so I presume that you can trap animals as well in certain areas. And I was actually looking on Google Maps, and you could see on the north part of the base, there's where all the buildings and roads and things like that are. And then in the southern part of the base is probably where they do more of the training because there's not as many buildings and things. And I was looking around some of the creeks and little ponds, and what did I see next door? Headquarters of SBCT. And then my buddy also mentioned that some people who trap animals torture them, which unfortunately didn't surprise me. And I thought, aren't the same people who torture animals at some point in their life the same people who end up torturing and killing people? And the thing is that a lot of people try to do this to people's cats or dogs, but obviously the owner could, try to find you and see what happened. And so if you're trapping animals like beavers, no one's coming to find them. And so you could do whatever you want and no one would ever know. So I'm not sure if there's a correlation between any of these things, but I thought it was interesting to consider. So who probably did this? Like I said, in this video, I mentioned a soldier. In previous videos, I mentioned it could have been a student or even someone that was a family relative of the housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh. But it could have been any of the hundreds or thousands of people that not only knew the Ramseys, but possibly went through their home. They lived there for 5 years, and in that time, they had tons of people come through their home. In just one instance, in December of 1994, their home was part of the 11th Historical Homes for the Holidays tour, and apparently 1,500 to 2,000 people could have been through their house. Now, that doesn't mean that they went through every room, but they would have had a basic layout. And who greeted them at the door? Burke and JonBenet, who was about 4 at that time. They hosted several Christmas and other parties over the years with their friends and coworkers and people from church. And they had tons of workers go through their home that were doing all that remodeling and painting. They had all these different babysitters and house cleaners, drivers, etc. Later, JonBenet was in all of these pageants and talent shows in the mall and in a parade during Christmas. So you have no idea how many perverts were going just to observe these kinds of things. 7 months after JonBenet lost her life, there was this girl, Amy, who attended the same dance school as JonBenet. She had been out with her mom, and then they'd come home, and she woke up in her room, and there was a dude in her room that was like, be quiet or I'll kill you or something. And luckily her mom heard something and opened the door, and the dude ran out and jumped out of the second-story window. But that could have been a really close call. And they found all of these cigarette butts just outside the house, kind of like outside the butler's pantry at the Ramsey house. But the Boulder PD said, oh, there's nothing to see here. And the interesting point is that the owners of their dance school was apparently never, ever interviewed by the Boulder police. They totally should have been interviewed to see if there was any unusual men who were like observing the kids dancing. So today in Boulder, you have 117 registered sex offenders. I'm not sure what that number was in 1996, but I'm guessing at least 75. These people know where to find kids. Of course, schools or churches or different areas are places where you might find kids. Or you could find some information about dance recitals, plays, and other areas where kids might go. Ted Bundy had looked up areas where girls might have plays, and he would go to those schools and end up abducting and killing girls. So these guys are doing these kinds of things and all around, and they became infatuated with her and might have really been into these kidnapping movies because there was a lot of kidnapping movies out at that time. And the movie theater that month was Ransom with Mel Gibson, and the year before was Speed. So I think they obsessed about kidnapping and this little girl. And Christmas night is a great time to do this kind of thing because there's less police on duty and most people are exhausted from, bringing out presents and having Christmas and probably have a few drinks. So it's the least likely time you would expect someone to do this. And that's actually how Ted Bundy escaped from Glenwood Springs jail in Colorado. He knew that there were less guards on duty at the end of December, and he escaped on December 30th. So these guys waited until the parents were gone, and they found one of these doors to get in, or the basement window. And since it was already 5 o'clock, it's dark, so they looked around with the flashlight. They got the layout of the house and probably found where, the knives or a bat was for protection. So they were probably above the garage in John Andrews' room. They hid under the bed while they came home. And you could see where they might have come out of the bed that the blanket comes out a bit. So it seems like they either pulled something out or someone had come out that way. And they probably left the rope there by accident with the backpack. And so they either grabbed JonBenet in a way like they were pretending they were the parents, or Lou Smit even mentioned they might have even used a stun gun, which I think would make her go crazy. But either way, I think there was some point when they were going downstairs that she started freaking out. And as I mentioned, there was that movie Ransom. And in that movie, the kid that they kidnap is super docile. He just kind of lays down in the bed and he's not yelling, he's not kicking. And I think the intruders were hoping that would happen and they would just slowly walk out the door and be on their merry way. But once she realized that this is not like her mom or dad, she obviously freaked out. And it wasn't like she was just like this. She was more like this. And so they knew that they weren't going to walk out in the street with a kid screaming and kicking. And so they probably brought her down into the basement to decide what to do next. That's probably when the guy grabbed the paint tote and started making this garrote to try to control her. And the other guy probably was looking around for a duffel bag or a suitcase or some way to get her out of the house. And they know that the suitcase was definitely used in some way because there was a black duvet in that suitcase and the fibers from that were on JonBenet. So they probably tried at some point to get her into that suitcase, which to me is crazy. I don't even think you'd get anyone over 2 years old in a suitcase. And so they didn't find anything else. But what I imagine happened is as he's making this garrote, and you could see the hair in there, they're probably very angry that this was not working out as planned, which if you study kidnappings like I have, and I have other videos on that, people make these big plans for weeks, months, or even years, and within the first minute, everything doesn't work out as planned. I think they were losing their temper. They were very angry that things were not working out. They maybe strangled her enough where she passed out for, 10 or 20 minutes while they're figuring out what to do. And at some point, maybe she woke up and she screamed really loud. And the guy was already so angry that things weren't looking out. And he hit her as hard as he could, either with the flashlight or the baseball bat or the golf club. And then they realized she might have not been dead, but she probably was not going to make it. So why even bring her out for kidnapping? Because you might get caught with her, especially if there's a roadblock or something, or you're coming back into base and they search your car because they heard that there's some kidnapping alert. And so they finished her by strangling her, and the cellar door was the closest area to the boiler room. They left her in there on the blanket and with her other clothes. They latched the door. They could have gone out the basement window, but they probably could have even just come out the butler door. They dropped the bat on the cement there because they don't need the bat anymore now that they're outside. And they got away for 29 years now. I'm not sure when they wrote the note, but it could have been for a couple reasons. But one reason would be to delay them from searching the house thoroughly, which worked. 2 officers and Fleet White did not find JonBenet in that room because they assumed it was a kidnapping. John didn't find her until 7 hours later from the time they called police. And if they were able to get her outside, the police would probably not look for her until, I don't know, maybe that evening or the next day. But they could have been halfway to Mexico or California by that time. So this note was great in delaying the police from either finding her or them. If there wasn't a note, they would have searched that house very thoroughly and found her within 30 minutes. And if she wasn't in that house, they would have been searching all over that town and on every news broadcast in Boulder and radio station would be blasting that Little Miss Colorado was missing, and everyone in that town would be on the lookout for an unusual looking male or two and a little blonde girl. But they were long gone, so it worked. I think if they even wrote a short ransom note, people might call their bluff. But the fact that it's so long and cryptic and unusual with this SBT, it just confuses people. And I think that was the intention that they wanted, and it worked. So what do I think about the DNA? I think they might get lucky, but I don't think it's going to be a slam dunk. Only 7% of the population is in CODIS. And some people think these private DNA companies can share the information with police, but that's not the case. The privacy laws protect them. As I mentioned, in 1996, there was that guy around Fort Carson. Well, it wasn't DNA that actually solved that case. It was the fingerprints. In 2014, the New Jersey State Patrol received a federal grant to process a backlog of fingerprint cards from cold cases, many of which were sent to them by law enforcement agencies from across the country. When the agency transferred physical fingerprint cards to a federal database, they came up with a match to this guy from his 1998 burglary conviction in Texas, which was his only brush with the law. So he was very close to getting away. And he actually ended up confessing and getting like 20 or 30 years. So the FBI started cataloging fingerprints in 1924, but didn't file them electronically until 1999. So if all of the fingerprints aren't even in the system, why would anyone think all of the DNA is in the system? Especially from like the late 90s or early 2000s. Like, I don't think they started doing that by law until more recently. So Boulder does have a new police chief who's going to meet with the Ramseys and I think try to test some of these pieces of evidence, which I think you can only do like one more time and then it's destroyed. There's a slight chance they might get lucky, but if this guy has a clean record after that time period, he could get off. But the only good news is that most of these people who are into these crazy things like erotic asphyxia and strangling kids would probably do something like that again. So there is a chance. But if we don't hear anything about the DNA in the next few months or year, I think they need to look at some other options. I know they've obviously focused on these pedos in Boulder a lot, but Denver's only 40 minutes away and has like 1 million people. And Colorado Springs has, I don't know, 300,000 people in that base there. So I think maybe they could try to look in some of these other cities and see what could come up, because I'm worried that the DNA is going to solve the case. So if you're out there and kind of an amateur detective, you know, do some research. I know I've contacted some people down around Fort Carson and asked for some names for anything that's come up in the past, and I found kind of an interesting thing. So if everyone's out there looking, who knows what you might find. But if you're going to rely on the DNA, well, it's already been 29 years, so they might have to look elsewhere. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, like and subscribe. This will conclude my series about JonBenet for right now. I think I've covered enough. Later on, I might do like some videos debunking some of the other theories, or any updates on this case. Otherwise, I'll do some other true crime stories and some of the other miscarriages of justice that happen in America. I've got a trip to Colombia, and I wanted to finish a little bit of my Peru trip, so I'll have a couple of videos of that, and I hope to see you when I get back from Colombia in a bit. So take care, be safe, and I hope to see you guys next time.